Welcome to the Self Reliant Living Show, where we talk all about a self-reliant lifestyle to save money, live greener, eat healthier, and be prepared for anything so you can take care of the ones you love in good times and bad. I'm your host, Jennifer Osech, a homeschooling mom of 3 boys. I'm the author of the Preparedness Planner series, and my husband and I are the lead teachers of Self Reliant School, a website dedicated to giving you the skills and confidence to take care of yourself and your community. Be sure to stop by and pick up your free videos from inside Self Reliant School that will get you started growing, cooking, and preserving your own food today. You can pick these up at selfreliantschool.com/free. Now, on with the show. So today we're going to talk about fermenting. And that is a rather large term for fermenting, because it can mean a few different things, especially with traditional methods of fermenting. It can mean that you have a couple different things going on. So let me just start with a formal definition. Okay, so fermentation is the process of converting carbohydrates to alcohol or organic acids using microorganisms. Okay, so these microorganisms are either yeast or bacteria, and they're usually under anaerobic conditions, and what that means is that they're kept away from air. There's no air involved in that. And so there are some exceptions to that. We'll get to those in a minute, but let me just go ahead and give the basic layout, and then you can hopefully ask some questions and make some comments about ferments. So in my book, there's 4 different kinds of ferments. Depending on what book you're reading or who you're listening to, you could have, people could say there's 2 kinds. Some people might say there's 3 kinds. So it's such an old tradition that it just really depends on the definition that you're using. But based on the definition that I'm using, I'm going to say that there's 4 different kinds. And I think that if you think of it in terms of 4 different kinds, then it'll make it easier to sort of categorize them in your head and know, oh, okay, that's this kind or that kind. All right, so the first one, and I'm going to just list them, and then I'm going to go through them. So the first one is lactic acid fermentation, or lacto-fermentation for short. Okay, so that's one. The second kind is a yeast fermentation. So that's the second one. The third one is an anacetic fermentation, and that is, we'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to list them because that's the reason that all of my shows have been going over, because I have so much to say about each one, but we'll get to it in a minute. And then the fourth one is a mixed fermentation. So that means that you have 2 of the other kinds of fermentation going on at the same time. Okay, so let me just take a second, and either on Periscope or Facebook, which type of ferments do you do? Do you know which kinds you do? And if you don't know them by those 4 names, you can just say whatever kind that, whatever you call it, whether it's sourdough, kombucha, whatever, and then I will look in the comments as I'm going through each one. Okay, so let's take the first one, lactic acid fermentation. And like I said, this is lacto-fermentation for short. And what this does is, this is what's known as old-fashioned pickling. So if you have made pickles the old-fashioned way with putting them under a brine in a salt brine, and then putting them on the counter in a cool place to ferment, then that's what's called lactic acid fermentation, or lacto-fermentation. And most vegetables are, well, all vegetables are, most vegetables, I want to say most because some are mixed, so let me just say most vegetables are fermented this way. Then also, this is how you get yogurt and cheese. It's all lacto-fermentation. Okay, so the second kind of fermentation is called yeast fermentation. And this is how you get alcohol. This is when yeast is converted to glucose and ethanol, which is alcohol. And so this is how we get wine and beer and some kinds of bread, depending on, it's not sourdough exactly, we'll get to that in a minute, but this is what's happening in bread when it rises. Okay, so those are the two really main types of fermentation. And if somebody's going to use the definition of just having two, those would be the two, because those are what's going on at the metabolic level, where the in lacto-fermentation, the good lactobacillus bacteria is involved, and it is crowding out all the bad bacteria and making the food safe to eat, and making that sort of sour taste as well. Okay, so, and that's also where you get probiotics. So sauerkraut, yogurt, those sorts of things, lacto-fermentation. And then yeast fermentation, like I said, that's how we get alcohol. And that's the main, alcohol and bread. Those are the two main things that you probably heard of that you make through yeast fermentation. Okay, so acidic fermentation is sort of a derivative, well, it is a derivative of yeast fermentation. And what that means is that after yeast fermentation has taken place and the mixture is turned to alcohol, if you take that mixture and open it up to the air, then that mixture will turn to vinegar. And that's what we mean by acidic fermentation. Okay, so, and you've heard obviously of wine turning to vinegar, and that's what this is. So it's a different process, and it makes a different thing, but it starts with yeast fermentation. So some people say that that is a third type of fermentation, including me. So far we have lactic acid fermentation, we have yeast fermentation, and then we have acetic fermentation. So the next one, it's not really a completely different fermentation, but I think it might help you categorize things, like I said before, and that's when you have a mixed fermentation. So what you have is a lactic acid or lacto-fermentation going on, and a yeast fermentation going on. And this is what's happening with sourdough, with kombucha, and things like that. So even though there are only two sort of things that happen at the metabolic level, and then when we talk about acetic, we're talking about a derivative of the yeast fermentation, and then the fourth one, we're talking about just mixing them together. So, like I said, depending on whose book you're reading and who you're talking to, that you can have from 2 to 4. But like I said before, this is going to help, I think, help you look at something and go, oh, I know what's going on inside there, and I know why it's doing what it's doing. So if you have the 4 sort of separated in your head, then I think that you can, like I said, know what's going on, and then also troubleshoot. So that's important. Okay, so let's talk about what some people call a 5th ferment, but I'm not calling it a 5th ferment, and that is mold. When you introduce mold into usually cheese, there are a few other things, but we'll just say cheese for now. Some people think that that is a ferment, and it's labeled as that, and it's fine, you know, because there are things going on, and it does change the taste and texture and all that of the thing it's in cheese. But by our definition, it's not converting carbohydrates to either alcohol or acid. So that's why I'm not going to include it. But I just did want to mention it because some people will say that it's a 5th type of ferment. Like I said, there are things going on in there, but it doesn't quite fit our definition. So it gets an honorable mention, right? But it doesn't get to be in our 4 different kinds of fermentation. Okay, so I'm just going to pause for a second, and look, we have lots of viewers. You guys, say something. Let me know you're out there. What kinds, like I said, of ferments have you created, if any, and what kind do you want to try? So please put that in the comments. And if I am not getting the comments and you're commenting, I am so sorry. I will We're trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. Like I said, it's mission control here, so we've got a ton of monitors, and that has happened before. So rest assured, if you are commenting and asking questions, I will go back and make sure all of those are answered, even if I'm not seeing them. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits of fermenting, because now we know what it is and how we can categorize it. Let's talk about the benefits. Why do we even want to do this in the first place? Well, the first one is to produce alcohol. And I'm not going to go into a long explanation of that. There are a ton of reasons people would think that is a benefit, from religious reasons all the way down to party reasons, right? So all throughout history, alcohol has been important in our culture one way or the other. And so that is a benefit for fermenting. I would like to say, while we're on the alcohol, is that one thing you might not think of is that a long time ago, when water was not safe to drink, people would give their children wine because it was not contaminated water. So even though we wouldn't do that today, it is a way of purifying what we have to drink and producing alcohol. And if we had conditions like that ever again, if that was all we had to drink, we might do that. So let me just wanted to mention that, because that's something that we usually don't think about. We usually think about the other aspects of alcohol, but there's that. Okay, so then we want to ferment to preserve food. And I touched on this with preserving pickles, but if you preserve cabbage and make sauerkraut, then you are allowing that cabbage to be edible for a long time after it's harvested. So that's what we're doing when we preserve anyway, and you're adding probiotics and other enzymes in there that are beneficial to your health and to digestion. So that's a really huge reason to do this, preserving your food and for the health benefits, which is number 3, and I've already gone into that. But it makes your food more digestible. And so that is a big benefit, especially if you have stomach problems or get bloated or whatever when you eat regular cabbage, because cabbage is not an easy thing to digest when it's raw, but when it's fermented, it is. It is much better to consume and digest, and without all of the nasty side effects. So also along the health benefits, I wanted to say that ferments, they will take away the anti-nutrients that prevent, I should say, our bodies from absorbing all the nutrients in the food. So again, health benefits. If you're going to do any kind of preserving and you want the best nutritional value, the best bang for your buck, as it were, I would definitely recommend fermenting, because like I said, you've got all of these benefits for your health. This is one that you might not think of normally, and that is that fermenting foods saves fuel, because when you ferment a food, you are making it where it needs less cooking time, or it may not need any cooking at all. So that's one of the reasons that we cook our vegetables and things like that, as well, taste and texture as well too, but that they're more easily digested. But if they're fermented, you don't have to cook them for them to be easily digested, and they taste great too. So that's number 6. I'm jumping ahead of myself, as taste. But let me tell you number 5, and that is that it helps make some foods less toxic. And here I'm thinking about olives and some nuts that need to be soaked before they're harvested anyway. So, okay, so 6, right, I've already said this, is taste, because it just adds a whole dimension of taste to the food if you ferment it, from sourdough to sauerkraut, to whatever, kombucha, just whatever you are fermenting. And then of course, wines, there's a whole, school of thought and, history behind that too. It just gives what you're fermenting so much more of a dimension of taste. And once you've tasted these things, you'll probably never want them another way, because they're so, so good. Okay, so let me go over some safety issues with fermenting. And fermenting doesn't last forever. And no preservation method lasts forever, but fermenting even doubly so, because you're dealing with a living food. Once you've fermented it, there's organisms in there that are alive. So it's really a living food that you have there, and those organisms aren't going to live in there forever. So it does have a shorter shelf life, but most of the time it will get you from season to season. So in other words, sauerkraut usually lasts several months over the winter. Okay, so that is one of the safety precautions, that you don't want to eat something that's been fermented 5 years ago, because probably not going to be anything living in there anyway for it to be worth eating. Okay, and here's one that you might not have thought of that's a safety precaution, at least I think it is. And that is when you go to a different culture, because almost every culture on earth has some sort of fermenting in their history and their traditions. But just because there are new ferments from different cultures, different from yours, you need to be careful, because that doesn't mean that they won't make you sick. And let me explain. Like, there is a culture in the Arctic, and what they do is, over the season where they can't get fish readily, is they bury their fish and it ferments. Okay, so if you're not from that region, you say you're from the tropics or something like that, or Texas, and you go and you eat some of that, it may nauseate you, it may smell disgusting, and you might just not have the microbes in your own body to eat that and be okay. It really might make you sick. So if it's something that you've never tried before and something that you weren't raised on, just be super careful, and that is to use common sense. If it makes you nauseated, don't eat it. If it looks moldy, then don't eat it. So, and I know that can get tricky sometimes, especially with kombucha I'm thinking of here. That can get tricky as to know whether it's moldy or not. And it's not that it's going to kill you if you eat it. Not that I'm advocating that you eat it. I'm just saying that you just need to use common sense. You need to use your eyes, your smell, your taste. If it tastes bad, don't eat it, right? So those are the safety sort of precautions that I have for you for fermenting. And so how do you get started? How do you even do this, right? Because it sounds kind of intimidating. It's sort of like chemistry and alchemy, and just, it's kind of weird, right? But it's so traditional. And what I would suggest is to start out with something that really motivates you. And if you're not that confident to do that, then start out with sauerkraut. That's like the easiest thing ever to ferment. But if you don't like sauerkraut or cabbage, you think you won't like it fermented, well, let me first tell you that it's just so different if you ferment it yourself. It's not the stuff that you get in a can or a jar from the store. It is not the same food. It starts out as cabbage, but ends up a way different kind of food. So I urge you to try it, because I think you will be pleasantly surprised. And that really, to me, is the easiest thing to ferment is sauerkraut. Okay, but if you are pretty sure you're not going to like that, then start out with something that motivates you. What are some fermented foods that you've tasted before that you really like? And then perfect that and learn how to do that, and then you can move on to another thing. So if you really love yogurt, learn how to make yogurt. If you really love kombucha, learn how to make kombucha. So I think that, if you start out with something you love, you're going to set yourself up for success. And then I just want to mention here that if you feel like you still need help with that, we have a home brewing e-course. I just want to let you know that. And Bill is the one that teaches that. He goes over all kinds of home brewing, from soda to beer to wine to mead. I mean, he brews everything. So if you feel like that you can't do it on your own, or if you would want more instruction about how to do those kinds of brewings, then we have a class for you, so you can take heart that we will walk you through it every step of the way. Okay, so what is one thing you'd like to ferment that you haven't tried? Because I am looking in the comments and I'm thinking it's, again, I cannot get them. I think what's happening is I refresh and then it gets old and then I have to refresh again, and so I'm not getting them. So we'll continue to work on that. But please leave them anyway, and that way I can go back and answer them once the show is over. Also leave them, like I said, if you're watching on the replay, because I love hearing from you. So let me go over some of the equipment. And I have a clock in the back, so I'm watching the time. It's brand new. And I will try and take a picture of it and put it on Instagram, because if you follow me on Instagram, you'll get a lot of the behind the scenes of this whole show and our whole family and the craziness that happens. So I'll try and remember to take a picture of it, because it's a huge clock with big letters and it's like flashing. Don't go over, don't go over. Okay, well, I'm almost finished, so let me go ahead and talk about equipment that's needed for fermenting. For pickling, all you're going to need is a jar and a weight. And so here I have a weight here to show you. This is a weight, and this would go into a jar. I usually put it in a mason jar, and then you do, in my opinion, you need an airlock. People have fermented years and years, throughout history without one. So you might have some luck, but I'm a big believer in setting people up for success. So I feel like that an airlock, and I have one here, is necessary. So you can make a hole in your mason jar and stick this in there. They sell lids for mason jars that have already a hole in there so that you can put your airlock in here. But what this is really quick is you go ahead and take off this top, right? And it has, can you see that? I don't know if I'm gonna angle it a little bit so you can see it. There's like a tube here, and that goes all the way down here. And so what you do is you take this and you fill it with water to about here. And then you're gonna take this plastic thing and you're going to put it in there, and that's gonna cover the air in here, so it's the mason jar won't have any air in it. And so what it's doing is it's letting out the CO2 that is happening in your ferment, and then it comes up without letting air in. So that keeps everything going really smoothly. So I feel like that you do need one of these if you're going to do home brewing or you're going to pickle something. This is something that you would need. The weight is for keeping your vegetables underneath the brine, because if they're not underneath the brine, it's not going to go as well, and you open yourself up for a chance of it molding or something like that. Okay, so for home brewing, and this is the yeast brewing or the yeast fermentation, you will need fermentation jug, an airlock, just like I showed you, and probably a tube or a siphon. So it's only a few things, and you do not have to spend a ton of money to get those things. A jug you could recycle from like a juice that you have bought or something, or you can get them fairly inexpensively. And this airlock is really inexpensive. It's made of plastic, and it's just maybe a few dollars. And then a tube for siphoning, and that's not, you don't need it completely need it. It's not a necessity, but it's nice to have. So, okay, so cheese making, what you would need is just, this is basic soft cheese. It's just some pots and some cheesecloth, and you're good. And you're good to go with making some soft cheese. Bread. Okay, so let me talk about, because I mentioned this with the sourdough and with bread. Let me just take a second here to talk about the difference between natural yeast and commercial yeast. So in commercial yeast, what's going on is the yeast fermentation. When you put commercial yeast, keep them straight here, commercial yeast into your bread, that's what's going on, is the yeast fermentation. When you are making bread with sourdough, you have a combination of the lactic acid fermentation and the yeast fermentation. So I just wanted to mention that. So sourdough and natural yeast, they're the same thing, called by two different names. So that has a double ferment going on. But so if you're going to make natural yeast or sourdough, you're going to need a starter. And that's a really easy thing to make, and we will talk about that really soon, probably on an upcoming show. And then commercial yeast, you would just need to buy the yeast, and then you can make bread. And that's, you just need your hands and something to bake the bread in, an oven, which most people have, and you're good. You could make that. And then tonics, you're going to need a SCOBY, a starter. So kombucha, kefir water, something like that, you would need to have a starter. And those are relatively inexpensive, and a lot of times you can get them from a friend because they seem to multiply and multiply. I know that my SCOBYs for my kombucha, there's so many, and I hate to throw them away, and there's other things you can do with them, but that's, again, for a different show. So do you have any special fermenting equipment? Do you have any that you already have? And let me know in the comments. Like I said, I'm not able to see them, but I will answer questions and respond to you when the show is over, and I can go to my other computer and they will all appear magically. And like I said, we'll try and get that fixed. Okay, so let me go over quickly because I'm going over time, but I am going quickly here. Common questions. One of the questions that I get a lot with fermenting is that mold? And usually I'll get a picture, which is helpful. But all I can tell you now is maybe it's mold and maybe it's not. Typically, like I said before, with the safety precautions, just use common sense, use your eyes, your nose, your taste to make sure. Typically, mold is green, and typically it's fuzzy. It can be other colors too, so, but I just, that's a general rule of thumb. If it is green and it is fuzzy, it's probably mold. Okay. And then another one is, do you have to have an airlock? The thing I just showed you, this little thing here, an airlock, it depends. It depends on what you're fermenting. If you're fermenting kombucha, no, you don't. If you're brewing kombucha, no. If you're making sourdough, no. If you are making alcohol, any kind of alcohol, yes. If you're making, if you're doing pickling for vegetables, yes. So there is that. Then the other question I get is, do you need a starter? Only if the thing that you're making requires a starter. And usually those are the mixed ferments, like kombucha, sourdough, things like that. You would either need a SCOBY or you would need a sourdough starter. So like I said, it depends on what you are making. All right, so fermenting is making a comeback. It was, I think, almost lost 10, 20 years ago, but it is making a comeback, I think, largely because of the nutritional value. And I really encourage you to make fermenting part of your preserving regimen. I believe in canning, dehydrating, and fermenting for all the different reasons that we've been going over these past few episodes. And it's just fun. It's fun to watch it come alive. And, that's literal, right? It's really fun to watch sourdough rise. So, and it's great for kids too. So if you have kids around you, it's really fun to do this with them so they can learn this really wonderful old tradition. Okay, so I am going to end it right here. Like I said, I almost made it. I just went a couple minutes over, and I'm doing better, right? It's not an hour-long show anymore. Hopefully never again, I don't know. We might have a wonderful guest someday, and it'll have to be, but that's for another time. Okay, so remember, being self-reliant isn't about you or being selfish. It's about being able to take care of yourself and your family so you can help take care of the people that you love. Take care until we talk again. I'm so glad you could join me today. Here's what to do next. Head over to selfreliantlife.tv to pick up the show notes for this episode and to watch replays of older episodes. To go directly to the show notes for this episode, go to selfreliantlife.tv and then, without a space, type a / and then the number of today's episode. You can watch this show live every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, live on Facebook or the Periscope app. Don't forget to stop by selfreliantschool.com/free to get your free Self-Reliant School videos that will help you get started living a self-reliant life. Also, if you're listening to this show as a podcast and you've liked what you've heard today, please subscribe through Stitcher, iTunes, or your favorite podcast app. If you're on a mobile device, just search for the Self Reliant Living Show. If you're on a laptop or desktop, just go to selfreliantlife.tv/iTunes. And while you're there, please leave a review. I love to hear from you. You leaving feedback makes it easier for others that are interested in living a self-reliant life to find my podcast. Take care until we talk again.